Before Pinocchio became the smiling wooden boy we grew up with, before Disney wrapped him in songs, magic, and innocence, there was another Pinocchio, a version carved in fear, shaped by cruelty, whispered about by people who understood the danger of creating something that pretends to be alive. Cut to a decaying marionette, dangling by a single frayed string. Long before animation softened him, this wooden figure came from a world that was anything but child-friendly. Back then, puppets weren't cute, they weren't harmless, they weren't made for comfort, they were made as warnings. Historians avoid discussing it, archivists hesitate to touch it, and the people of 19th century Italy, the very people who first heard the tale, didn't tell it to soothe their children. They told it to frighten them, to keep them obedient, to remind them what happens when the line between the living and the imitation begins to tremble. Shadowy sketches of marionettes with long, unnatural limbs fade in. The first Pinocchio wasn't a friend. He wasn't a dreamer. He wasn't even a hero. He was a punishment, the embodiment of a child's darkest behaviors, the part society wanted to carve away and burn. But here's the part almost no one knows. This story didn't just reflect the horrors of its time, it hid them. What Disney transformed into a tale of hope was originally a portrait of suffering, fear, and moral violence, and something even older lurking behind the blank wooden smile. The truth behind Pinocchio was never meant for children, and once you hear it, you'll understand why the original version was rewritten, erased, and buried under a century of polished lies. Fade to black. A single haunting violin note rises. Tonight we strip away the varnish, and what remains is splintered, vicious, and disturbingly alive. Welcome to the forgotten corridors of storytelling, places where familiar tales lose their masks and reveal what their creators truly feared. Old parchment illustrations flicker, starving children, collapsing streets, shadowed puppet theaters. Pinocchio's origin wasn't born in a warm workshop filled with singing clocks. It began in the alleys of a collapsing nation, among pickpockets, beggars, desperate families, and craftsmen who prayed their creations wouldn't turn on them. Cut to the silhouette of a wooden figure standing in a flickering alley. This tale grew not from fantasy, but from fear, from grief, and from a society so desperate to control its youth that it carved a monster to scare them into obedience. Printing plates slam into place, producing the first serialized pages. Tonight we return to the original Pinocchio, the one carved with brutality, shaped by despair, and nearly erased from history. Title slowly emerges. The disturbing true story behind Pinocchio. What Disney never told you to understand why this story survived centuries. We have to enter a world where wood can breathe, shadows can whisper, and innocence is carved by hands that tremble. The oldest accounts do not begin with magic. They begin with loneliness. In every retelling, he has a different name, but the earliest, most forbidden manuscripts call him Il Falegname Ambroso, the shadowed carpenter. He lived alone at the cliff's edge, a man carved hollow by loss, haunted by the memory of a child he never held. Every night he crafted toys for children that would never call him father. But according to the villagers, his last creation was born from something else entirely. One winter night, lightning split the sky open. In each flash, he saw a twisted shape inside the trunk of a fallen tree, a shape disturbingly human. He dragged the wood into his workshop and carved until morning, guided by a force he couldn't explain. When dawn arrived, the figure on his table was the shape of a boy, thin, fragile, and hollow-eyed. A face that seemed to be watching him even before he finished carving it. For days, the carpenter refused to carve a mouth. He feared what might speak through it. But on the seventh night, as he cleaned his tools, the workshop grew unnaturally cold. Then came a sound, a breathless, splintered whisper curling from behind him. Baba, the old man froze. He had carved no mouth, no lips, no voice. The puppet should not speak, but it did. The carpenter tried to teach it manners, to shape it into the son he wished for. But the oldest Italian notes are brutally clear. Il burattino non aveva anima umana. The puppet did not have a human soul. It disobeyed. It mocked. It roamed the village at night. Livestock were found clawed open. Children whispered about scratching at their windows. One terrified girl claimed she saw a small figure standing at the foot of her bed, smiling. The villagers begged the carpenter to burn it, but grief makes fools of men. He protected the puppet even as it grew more violent, more aware, more hungry. Marionettes rely on strings. They are controlled. But eyewitness accounts describe something else. A boy-sized figure moving with jolting, broken precision, as if bones were snapping into place with every step. No strings, no puppeteer. Just the sound of wood knocking against wood echoing between the trees. Locals called it Il Senza Fili, the stringless one, a creature that longed to be human, but could only imitate humanity like a mask stretched over something unspeakable. Later versions would transform this into a fairy, a wish, a miracle. But the original accounts are far more disturbing. A celestial object, blue, pulsing, moving with unnatural grace, descended above the carpenter's home. Inside, the puppet convulsed violently, as if its body was being rewritten by something ancient. Witnesses reported screams, not wooden cracks, not crafted tones, but human screams being forced into a body that wasn't meant to hold them. When the blue light vanished, the cottage was silent. Inside, villagers found tools scattered across the floor and a trail of splinters leading into the forest. The puppet was gone, and so was the carpenter. For decades, the story traveled from village to village, and with each retelling, writers softened the horror. A creature of hunger became a curious child. A violent mimic became a misunderstood dreamer. A monster became a moral lesson. Pages were cleaned, names altered, nightmares erased. But if you search deep enough in dusty church warnings, in forgotten diaries, in the footnotes scholars try not to translate, you'll still find traces of the real story. A puppet born from grief, touched by something celestial and unknown, desperate to replace the human life it could never have. A creature that learned to walk, then learned to want, then learned to destroy. And this is only the surface, because behind the legend lies something older, darker, and far more human than anyone dares to admit. The truth was never in the puppet. The truth was in the hands that carved it. To understand the puppet, we must understand the man who carved it and the forces that answered his grief. Because the original tale was never meant to be read by children. It was meant as a warning about obsession, about the dangers of carving life from despair, about the doorway grief can open for things that should never walk through. Before he was the shadowed carpenter, he was simply a father mourning a child whose name was never carved into the stone. Night after night, he visited the grave, speaking to it, begging it, pleading with it to speak back. The village records are fragmented, but they agree on one thing. The child's death was not natural. There are whispers of a wasting sickness, an illness that twisted the bones and hollowed out the eyes. Some said the child died. Others insisted the body simply vanished. But the oldest account reads, Il ragazzo fu preso dalla luce blu. The boy was taken by the blue light, the same light that would later awaken the puppet. The wood that became the puppet did not come from any normal tree. It came from a forest the villagers avoided, not out of superstition but out of fear. Travelers who slept beneath those trees spoke of strange dreams, of wooden limbs growing from their skin, of whispering branches, of a presence moving below the roots like something breathing underground. The locals called it La Selva del Sospiro, the forest of sighs, not poetic, literal. At night, the trees exhaled a long, low sigh as if something inside them was trying to escape. The carpenter ignored every warning. He found a fallen trunk after a storm, dragged it home, and carved his heartache into it. What he didn't know was that the wood already had a purpose. Some historians believe it once belonged to a pagan sect, a forgotten cult that carved ritual effigies to lure wandering spirits into hollow wooden vessels. The carpenter thought he was carving a child. In truth, he was carving a container, Early scholars agreed the puppet did not carry the soul of the carpenter's child, and it did not contain the carpenter's grief. It held something older, something hungry, a passenger, a being that layered itself in imitation, not to become human, but to consume human behavior like a meal. In old European folklore, these creatures were known as Imitatori, the imitators, shapeless spirits that could not create their own forms and instead slid themselves into whatever vessel they found, bone, wax, wood, or flesh. They could mimic speech, imitate laughter, copy affection, but they could never replicate a soul. This explains the puppet's cruelty, its sudden violence, its frantic hunger for human attention, its lack of remorse. It didn't want to be real. It wanted to be filled. Disney transformed this element into a benevolent fairy, a glowing guide who offered wishes. But the oldest manuscripts describe the blue light as cold, indifferent, sentient. Old astronomical journals record a glowing blue sphere hovering above that region for 3 consecutive nights. Livestock refused to sleep. Children slipped into fever dreams. Shadows inside homes moved as though controlled by something unseen. Researchers now believe the blue light was not granting life. It was transferring something, perhaps awakening the imitator in the wood, perhaps fusing with it, perhaps feeding on the carpenter's grief like a spark seeking fuel. Some accounts say the entity entered the puppet. Others claim it shed the puppet like a discarded shell and walked away wearing something else. Either way, whatever left that workshop was no longer crafted by human hands. As the legend spread, the church intervened. The earliest texts contained explicit warnings. Do not carve human forms from haunted wood. Do not speak grief into empty vessels. Do not call down lights from the sky. Do not invite imitation spirits. These passages were edited, burned, rewritten, or buried. Priests feared that the original legend would inspire forbidden rituals, rituals that might open the doorway again. So the story was rewritten. Horror became morality. Possession became mischief. A cosmic entity became a fairy godmother. The puppet changed. The meaning changed. The danger was erased. But in locked archives and private collections, in pages stained with soot, the original sketches remain. A puppet with too many joints, eyes carved too deep, limbs bending the wrong way, and above its head, a hovering blue flame like a halo made of cold fire. Strip away the mythology and a darker truth remains. The story of the puppet is the story of a man driven mad by grief, a man who tried to carve life from the shape of death, a man who refused to accept loss until something in the wood answered him. The puppet is not the villain. It is the symptom. The true horror lives in the carpenter's hands. Hands that tried to carve a replacement. Hands that shaped despair into a face. Hands that built a doorway and didn't recognize what stepped through. Narrator final whisper. And yet, even this truth is not the deepest cut in the tale. Because behind the grief, behind the entity, behind the cursed wood, lies a reason this legend refused to die. A reason carved into dates, symbols, and hidden margins. The puppet was never the story. It was only the vessel. The real truth is older than the carpenter, older than the forest, older than the legend we think we know. We believed the puppet was the story. We believed grief and the blue light were the heart of the legend. We were wrong. The puppet was only the mask. The story, the warnings, the ritualized blue light, all of it concealed something far older, something deliberate, something hidden. Researchers examining the earliest texts noticed a pattern. Triangular symbols etched along the joints, tiny notches carved into the soles of its feet, a spiraling mark on the chest resembling a celestial orbit. At first glance, mere decoration. But under ultraviolet light, the symbols glow faintly. They correspond to ancient numerology, sacred calendars, and cosmic cycles. The pattern is clear. The puppet was never a puppet. It was a vessel, a marker of time, a signal of when cosmic alignments would allow transference. The carpenter's grief was real, but it was exploited. Archival evidence hints at a clandestine society hidden in the forests surrounding the village. Their goal: to awaken and bind imitatory entities to human vessels at precise moments dictated by the stars. The carpenter carved the puppet, thinking it was for his child. In truth, he was performing a ritual he did not understand. Every detail, the wood, the timing, the blue light, was orchestrated. Every sleepless night, every whispered plea fed a process that spanned generations. This explains the anomalies, the puppet's unnatural behavior, the life it seemed to gain, the shadow that haunted the carpenter's home. Each alignment strengthened the entity. Each carved joint served as a temporal marker for when the human world was most vulnerable. The fairy tale is a codified warning, a story rewritten for innocence. While hiding an old world secret, grief can summon more than memories. It can summon forces beyond comprehension. Historians found subtle traces across Europe. Villages plagued by disappearances coinciding with puppet-like carvings. Records of children returning as something else, or never returning at all. Churches quietly burned entire manuscripts to prevent knowledge of these rites from spreading. Disney's version wasn't just a softening, it was a cover-up, a sanitization, because the original tale was too dangerous to tell aloud. The truth: the puppet never wanted to be Pinocchio. It was never a child. It was never a fairy tale. It was the key, a ritualized object where grief, human intent, and cosmic alignment converged. A doorway, a doorway through which Imitatori could enter the human world. The blue light, not guidance, not magic, it was the signal, the ignition, the spark. History, legend, every adaptation was just a story hiding the mechanics of the door. The puppet was never real. The grief, the carpenter, the light, all distractions. The truth is cosmic, mechanical, and terrifyingly precise. For centuries, we were told the story as if it were innocent. Now you know it was never innocent. Centuries have passed. The forests are gone, villages forgotten. Yet the story of Pinocchio lives on, not as a warning, not as a ritual, but as entertainment. Disney turned horror into whimsy, the puppet into a symbol of innocence, but the shadows remain. Even today, faint traces linger, tiny carvings hidden in old workshops, stories whispered among craftsmen who still remember, children's tales that feel unsettlingly familiar if you know how to look. Modern adaptations soften the darkness, talking animals, moral lessons, happy endings. Yet beneath the surface, the structure persists. The puppet still moves when grief or desire is too strong. The puppet still marks time in subtle, unseen ways. And the skeleton of the original tale, its ritualistic heart, haunts every retelling like a ghost just out of reach. Few realize that wooden puppets and carvings were once linked to disappearances across Europe. The childlike behavior of Pinocchio reflects beliefs about transference, imitation, and possession. The story's moral lessons, truth, bravery, obedience, were tools guiding humans unknowingly into a ritual. Even today, dolls and puppets carry an uncanny pull. It's not nostalgia, it's the echo of something older, something darker, something deliberate. The world forgot the old warnings. We embrace the story as harmless fantasy, but objects remain, stories remain. The pattern is still there. And if grief and desire grow strong enough, if the timing aligns, the puppet's legacy can awaken again. A cultural relic hidden in plain sight. Pinocchio was never just a puppet. He was a doorway, a warning, a secret humanity forgot. In the quiet corners of forgotten workshops, in the margins of stories we thought we knew, the echoes of Pinocchio linger. He is no longer a child of whimsy. He is a reminder that every tale carries a shadow, and every shadow hides a truth. A puppet carved from wood comes alive with grief, desire, and fear. A story meant to teach obedience was a map to something far older. The puppet's strings are not just wood and thread. They are tied to human fear, to human longing, to the darkness that whispers when the night is still. We laugh at Disney's Pinocchio, we sing its songs, we see a smiling puppet. But remember, beneath the painted smile, beneath the gentle voice, lies a shadow that has waited centuries, a shadow that watches, a shadow that remembers. Some stories are meant to be remembered, some stories are meant to be feared, and Pinocchio is both.